Everybody, where we finished last week, I was just starting to talk about the energy systems involved in muscle function. But I want to take a moment to review some terms that I presented to you. And those include, first of all, enzymes. And just you don't have to go back and look at the PowerPoint back in the terminology, but just for review, enzymes are the proteins that cells make to speed up the chemical reactions of life. And because the chemical reactions of life are too slow, enzymes speed them up so that we can live. In order for those enzymes to work, a steady state or homeostasis must be maintained, which includes temperature and pH. Now, something I forgot to bring up last week is that when cells change the form of energy, as a matter of fact, if you recall from high school chemistry, whenever you change the form of energy, for example, in your car, from chemical energy, gasoline, to kinetic energy, which is the motion of your car, there's energy released. And it's the same thing in your body. When you take the food that you eat, which is changed into glucose and ATP, and you change it into the energy of life, or in our case, so we're talking about motion, you produce energy. You release heat energy, I should say. And one of the things I pointed out about homeostasis is that if the temperature of your body gets too warm, like when you're sick and you have a fever, those enzymes don't work as well, or if the fever gets too high, stop working and you die. Well, it's a funny thing about the enzymes that I'm referring to in your body, in that they actually do work better at a slightly elevated body temperature. So when you want top performance, one of the things you need to do is warm up. And when you start to exercise, you start changing the chemical energy of ATP into the kinetic energy of motion, and heat energy is produced. Your body temperature goes up slightly, and those enzymes start to work better. So it is absolutely essential that your athletes, before they race, warm up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in my presentation. Again, just another bit of review is that we've already established that the fastest human being on earth, Usain Bolt, in the 100-meter and 200-meter sprint races in track, in the 100 meters, I showed you their splits, and Bolt and every person on earth cannot sprint for even 9.5 or 10 seconds. They start to slow down at the end of even a 100-meter race. So that means that your swimmers can't sprint even a 50, unless they even a 50. And your little kids who are going to be going a 25 might not even be able to sprint a 25 the whole way. All right, let's see. The next thing I wanted to review was the idea of actin and myosin being the proteins found in your muscle cells, and that when a nerve impulse hits the actin and myosin, they've been kept separated by another substance. But when the nerve impulse hits the muscle cells, that third chemical is temporarily broken down, and the actin and myosin combine. And that's why I have there actin plus myosin equals actomyosin. And that actomyosin spontaneously shrinks. And that's the muscle contraction. And I use the word spontaneously because when something is spontaneous, it happens all by itself. There is no outside influence whatsoever. So, in other words, your muscle cells spontaneously shrink. They do not require energy. What requires energy is that once the muscle is contracted, it must relax. And the relaxation means that the actomyosin must be broken down back into actin and myosin, and that takes energy. And the energy comes initially from a substance called ATP, or not originally, but always. And ATP is the only direct source of energy. And when you first start to move, there is a source. The source of energy actually comes from ATP and another substance, creatine phosphate. And all the energy is used for recycling ATP from. All right, now this is just for review. Hopefully, it's nothing new. And please pay attention to the arrows that I've got drawn on there. And what I'd said a moment ago was that in a muscle contraction, the top line. That's okay. All right. If you notice in the chemical reaction, the arrow goes both directions. That means that the chemical reaction can occur in both reactions. And what happens when the muscle cell contracts, a nerve impulse allows for the actin and the myosin to combine. So the arrow goes to the right and it forms actomyosin, and that's the stuff that spontaneously shrinks. For the muscle to work again, the actin-myosin must be broken apart back into actin and myosin, and that comes from energy. The energy to do that comes from a real quick chemical reaction on this substance, ATP. And if you recall from my presentation last week, I pointed out how ATP is constructed, and that the T stands for 3 or tri, TRI, and so the ATP. There's an enzyme, and the name of the enzyme is adenosine triphosphokinase. The enzyme breaks apart the ATP into ADP plus the third phosphate, but the energy is released. And that energy, if you look at that real thin arrow on the right side, goes up and breaks apart the actomyosin back into actin and myosin, and now the muscle relaxes. But you only have, if you recall, I mentioned last week, enough ATP for immediate energy for only a couple of seconds. Well, where do you get more energy to break apart the ATP? You can't go out and eat something real quick. You get the energy from a substance called creatine phosphate. And you may have heard about creatine supplementation in your diet, which, by the way, does have a minor effect on athletic performance. Nothing major. It has a number of negative side effects, including digestive system problems, which are the main side effect. But going back to it, the energy to put together ADP and P, okay, they have to be put back together before they can be used again, comes first from creatine phosphate. And so what happens is the enzyme breaks apart creatine phosphate, and you get energy. The energy is used by the cell to put ADP and P, which originally came from ATP, puts the ADP and P back together into ATP. Then the ATP can be reused. It can be, as I wrote down there, energy to recycle ATP. You have enough creatine phosphate for about 8, some people a little bit longer, about maybe up to about 12 seconds, 13 seconds of exercise. But then again, you run out of energy to recycle ADP and P back into ATP, so it can be broken apart to get the energy to break apart the actomyosin. If you follow the arrows, that sentence I just said makes all kinds of sense. If you don't follow the arrows, it makes no sense whatsoever. So I am going to repeat it. Everything comes down to ATP for energy. When the ATP is used up quickly, and the energy from ATP is used to break apart actomyosin back into actin and myosin. Look at that flow. Look at that graph or that flow chart. So to recycle the ADP and P back into ATP, you first use creatine phosphate. The energy from the creatine phosphate goes up to add the ADP and P back together into ATP. The ATP then goes through the middle red line again to be broken apart to release the energy to break apart actomyosin back into actin and myosin. Now the muscle can contract again. This all takes a split second. It's amazing, but it only takes a split second to occur. Okay, let's see. Any questions? Everybody's good with this? Okay. All right. The next slide, again, after you run out of creatine phosphate, then your body goes into the use of a substance called glucose. Now, this is a chemical reaction that does not require oxygen. And the word meaning that oxygen is not involved at the very top of the slide is anaerobic. This is what's called anaerobic respiration. And what happens in this is, again, more enzymes, tons of enzymes in this one, actually. And there's the most basic sugar. Whenever you see there's that word glucose, at the end of the word glucose are the three letters OSE. That means it's a sugar. You have table sugar that's called sucrose. Cells for plants, cell plants are called cellulose, OSE. They're all forms of sugar, and you know it's a sugar by the OSE. The simplest of all sugars is glucose, and your body breaks apart the glucose with an enzyme, and it releases two substances, one of which is called pyruvic acid, and also a hydrogen molecule. And I'll get back to those in a couple of seconds. But it also releases energy. And if you follow that thin line, where does the energy go? It goes back up to the ADP and P. The cell uses the energy to put them together back into ATP. The ATP then breaks up with an enzyme, is broken apart back into ADP and P, but it releases energy. Where does that energy go? Follow that straight thin arrow line. It goes up to the actomyosin, which is the contracted form of the muscle. And then that breaks apart the actomyosin, and the muscle cell can relax. And then the whole system goes again, and your muscle cell can contract. All right? Questions, folks? Everybody's following it. Okay, next slide. Now, this reaction, the glucose, right in the middle, glucose plus the enzyme gives us pyruvic acid and hydrogen. If that hydrogen and pyruvic acid sit in the muscle cell for too long, and it's not very long, there's not enough oxygen, those two things combine to make this substance that you've probably all heard of called lactic acid. And lactic acid interferes with the enzymes that break apart the ATP into ADP and P plus energy, the top large red line. So that's a problem. That can be a problem. Hold on just a second here. All right, let's see here. Okay, Mark, go ahead down two more slides where it says aerobic respiration. I don't know why I have a C on that. There we go. Keep going. That's where we started this morning. Next slide. All right. Now, the last slide that I talked about, I said it was anaerobic respiration, and it creates this stuff called lactic acid. That is because if there's not enough oxygen present. If there is oxygen present, then what happens is the pyruvic acid combines with the oxygen, and your body makes carbon dioxide and water. You exhale the carbon dioxide, and the water is any excess water is eliminated through urine. And the deal with it is this chemical reaction produces tons of energy, but still not a lot. And I'd mentioned only a few molecules of energy before in another slide. This produces up to 36 molecules of ATP. And again, follow the line, and of course, everything goes back to the recycling of ATP from ADP and phosphate, and it stores the energy temporarily, so the ATP can be broken down again. And when it's broken down, then the energy from that breakdown goes to actomyosin, which is the contracted form of the muscle, back into actin and myosin, which is the relaxed form of the muscle. And now the muscle can work again. All right, next slide. And this process is what is called cellular respiration. If you recall back to high school biology, this was when you learn about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This is the chemical reaction that your teacher should have presented to you. And what it is C6H12O6. That's glucose. Plus 6 molecules of oxygen in the cells is combined, and they release 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water and energy for cell function. And we've been through all that already. All right, next slide. Now, after depending on the level of your conditioning, if you continue to exercise for a long period of time, then after, no problem. You're being a big help here. Keep going. You're good. Keep going. Fat metabolism. All right. We've gone through the ATP creatine phosphate cycle, glucose, both anaerobic and aerobic, and then after these sources of energy are like a foot race. They all start at the same time, but some take longer and longer to get functioning. So the ATP and creatine phosphate occurs that fast. The glucose actually takes about 2 minutes to get working aerobically. If you remember exercising, the first 2 minutes of warm up in practice